This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of the Spirit and the Life of Today by Evelyn Underhill. Read by Mary Reagan. Chapter 4, Part B. Psychology and the Life of the Spirit 2. Contemplation and Suggestion. We must now go on, and indeed any psychological study of prayerful experience must lead us on, to the subject of suggestion, and its relation to the inner life. By suggestion, of course, is here meant, in conformity with current psychological doctrine, the process by which an idea enters the deeper and unconscious psychic levels and there becomes fruitful. Its real nature, and in consequence something of its far-reaching importance, is now beginning to be understood by us, a fact of great moment both for the study and the practice of the spiritual life. Since the transforming work of the Spirit must be done through man's ordinary psychic machinery, and in conformity with the laws which govern it, every such increase in our knowledge of that machinery must serve the interests of religion, and show its teachers the way to success. Suggestion is usually said to be of two kinds. The first is heterosuggestion, in which the self-realizing idea is received either wittingly or unwittingly from the outer world. During the whole of our conscious lives, for good or evil, we are at the mercy of such heterosuggestions, which are being made to us at every moment by our environment, and they form, as we shall afterwards see, a dominant factor in corporate religious exercises. The second type is autosuggestion. In this, by means of the conscious mind, an idea is implanted in the unconscious and there left to mature. Thus do willingly accepted beliefs, religious, social, or scientific, gradually and silently permeate the whole being and show their results in character. A little reflection shows, however, that these two forms of suggestion shade into one another, and that no heterosuggestion, however impressively given, becomes active in us until we have in some sort accepted it and transformed it into an autosuggestion. Theology expresses this fact in its own special language when it says that the will must cooperate with grace if it is to be efficacious. Thus the primacy of the will is safeguarded. It stands or should stand at the door, selecting from among the countless dynamic suggestions, good and bad, which life pours in on us, those which serve the best interests of the self. As a rule, men take little trouble to sort out the incoming suggestions. They allow uncriticized beliefs and prejudices, the ideas of hatred, anxiety, or ill health, free entrance. They fail to seize and affirm the ideas of power, renovation, joy. They would be more careful did they grasp more fully the immense and often enduring effect of these accepted suggestions, the extent in which the fundamental, unreasoning psychic deeps are plastic to ideas. Yet this plasticity is exhibited in daily life first under the emotional form of sympathy, response to the suggestion of other people's feeling states, and next under the conative form of imitation, active acceptance of the suggestion made by their appearance, habits, deeds. All political creeds, panics, fashion, and good form witness to the overwhelming power of suggestion. We are so accustomed to this psychic contagion that we fail to realize the strangeness of the process, but it is now known to reach a degree previously unsuspected, and of which we have not yet found the limits. In the religious sphere, the more sensational demonstrations of this psychic suggestibility have long been notorious. Obvious instances are those ecstatics, some of them true saints, some only religious invalids, whose continuous and ardent meditation on the cross produced in them the actual bodily marks of the Passion of Christ. In less extreme types, perpetual dwelling on this subject, together with that eager emotional desire to be united with the sufferings of the Redeemer, which medieval religion encouraged, frequently modified the whole life of the contemplative, shaping the plastic mind, and often the body too, to its own mold. A good historic example of this law of religious suggestibility is the case of Julian of Norwich. As a young girl, Julian prayed that she might have an illness at 30 years of age, and also a closer knowledge of Christ's pains. She forgot the prayer, but it worked below the threshold, as forgotten suggestions often do, and when she was 30, the illness came. Its psychic origin can still be recognized in her own candid account of it, and with the illness the other half of that dynamic prayer received fulfillment, in those well-known visions of the Passion to which we owe the revelations of divine love. 99. This is simply a striking instance of a process which is always taking place in every one of us, for good or evil. The deeper mind opens to all who knock, provided that the newcomers be not the enemies of some stronger habit or impression already within. To suggestions which coincide with the self's desires or established beliefs it gives an easy welcome, and these, once within, always tend to self-realization. Thus the French Carmelite Thérèse de l'Enfant Jésus, once convinced that she was destined to be a victim of love, began that career of suffering which ended in her death at the age of 24. 100. The lives of the saints are full of incidents explicable on the same lines, exhibiting again and again the dramatic realization of traditional ideas or passionate desires. We see, therefore, that St. Paul's admonition, "Whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things be of good report, think on these things," is a piece of practical advice of which the importance can hardly be exaggerated, for it deals with the conditions under which man makes his own mentality. Suggestion, in fact, is one of the most powerful agents either of self-destruction or of self-advancement which are within our grasp, and those who speak of the results of psychotherapy or the certitudes of religious experience as mere suggestion are unfortunate in their choice of an adjective. If, then, we wish to explore all those mental resources which can be turned to the purposes of the spiritual life, this is one which we must not neglect. The religious idea, rightly received into the mind and reinforced by the suggestion of regular devotional exercises, always tends to realize itself. "Receive his leaven," says William Penn, "and it will change thee; his medicine, and it will cure thee. He is as infallible as free, without money and with certainty. Yield up the body, soul, and spirit to him that maketh all things new, new heaven and new earth, new love, new joy, new peace, new works, a new life and conversation." 101. This is fine literature, but it is more important to us to realize that it is also good psychology, and that here we are given the key to those amazing regenerations of character which are the romance and glory of the religious life. Pascal's too celebrated saying that if you take holy water regularly you will presently believe, witnesses on another level to the same truth. Fears have been expressed that by such an application of the laws of suggestion to religious experience, we shall reduce religion itself to a mere favorable subjectivism, and identify faith with suggestibility. But here the bearing of this series of facts on bodily health provides us with a useful analogy. Bodily health is no illusion. It does not consist in merely thinking that we are well, but is a real condition of well-being and of power, depending on the state of our tissues and the correct balance and working of our physical and psychical life. And this correct and wholesome working will be furthered and steadied, or, if broken, may often be restored by good suggestions. It may be disturbed by bad suggestions, because the controlling factor of life is mind, not chemistry, and mind is plastic to ideas. So too the life of the spirit is a concrete fact, a real response to a real universe. But this concrete life of faith, with its growth and its experiences, its richly various working of one principle in every aspect of existence, its correspondences with the eternal world, its definitely ontological references, is lived here and now, in and through the self's psychic life, and indeed his bodily life too, a truth which is embodied in sacramentalism. Therefore, sharing as it does life's plastic character, it too is amenable to suggestion, and can be helped or hindered by it. It is indeed characteristic of those in whom this life is dominant that they are capable of receiving and responding to the highest and most vivifying suggestions which the universe, in its totality, pours in on us. This movement of response, often quietly overlooked, is that which makes them not spiritual hedonists, but men and women of prayer. Grace, to give these suggestions of spirit their conventional name, is perpetually beating in on us. But if it is to be inwardly realized, the divine suggestion must be transformed by man's will and love into an autosuggestion. And this is what seems to happen in meditation and prayer. Everything indeed points to a very close connection between what might be called the mechanism of prayer and of suggestion. To say this is in no way to minimize the transcendental character of prayer. In both states there is a spontaneous or deliberate throwing open of the deeper mind to influences which, fully accepted, tend to realize themselves. Look at the directions given by all great teachers of prayer and contemplation, and these two acts, rightly performed, fuse one with the other. They are two aspects of the single act of communion with God. Look at their insistence on a stilling and a recollecting of the mind, on surrender, a held passivity not merely limp but purposeful, on the need of meek yielding to a greater inflowing power and its regenerating suggestions. Then compare this with the method by which health-giving suggestions are made to the bodily life. In the deeps of the soul His word is spoken. Is not this an exact description of the inward work of the self-realizing idea of holiness received in the prayer of quiet into the unconscious mind, and there experienced as a transforming power? I think we may even go further than this and say that grace is, in effect, the direct suggestion of the spiritual affecting our soul's life. As we are commonly docile to the countless heterosuggestions, some of them helpful, some weakening, some actually perverting, which our environment is always making to us, so we can and should be so spiritually suggestible that we can receive those given to us by all-penetrating divine life. What is generally called sin, especially in the forms of self-sufficiency, lack of charity, and the indulgence of the senses, renders us recalcitrant to these living suggestions of the Spirit. The opposing qualities, humility, love, and purity, make us, as we say, accessible to grace. Son, says the inward voice to Thomas à Kempis, my grace is precious, and suffereth not itself to be mingled with strange things nor earthly consolations. Wherefore it behoveth thee to cast away impediments to grace, if thou willest to receive the inpouring thereof. Ask for thyself a secret place, love to dwell alone with thyself, seek confabulation of none other, put the readiness for God before all other things, for thou canst not both take heed to me, and delight in things transitory. This grace is a light supernatural and a special gift of God, and a proper sign of the chosen children of God, and the earnest of everlasting health. For God lifteth up man from earthly things to love heavenly things, and of him that is fleshly maketh a spiritual man. 102. Could we have a more vivid picture than this of the conditions of withdrawal and attention under which the psyche is most amenable to suggestion, or of the inward transfiguration worked by a great self-realizing idea? Such transfiguration has literally on the physical plane caused the blind to see, the deaf to hear, the dumb to speak, and it seems to me that it is to be observed operating on highest levels in the work of salvation. When further à Kempis prays, increase in me more grace, that I may fulfill thy word, and make perfect mine own health, is he not describing the right balance to be sought between our surrender to the vivifying suggestions of grace and our appropriation and manly use of them? This is no limp acquiescence and merely infantile dependence, but another aspect of the vital balance between the indrawing and outgiving of power, and one of the main functions of prayer is to promote in us that spiritually suggestible state in which, as Dionysius the Areopagite says, we are receptive of God. It is, then, worth our while from the point of view of the spiritual life to inquire into the conditions in which a suggestion is most likely to be received and realized by us. These conditions, as psychologists have so far defined them, can be resumed under the three heads of quiescence, attention, and feeling, outstanding characteristics, as I need not point out, of the state of prayer, all of which can be illustrated from the teaching and experience of the mystics. First, let us take quiescence. In order fully to lay open the unconscious to the influence of suggested ideas, the surface mind must be called in from its responses to the outer world, or in religious language, recollected, till the hum of that world is hardly perceived by it. The body must be relaxed, making no demands on the machinery controlling the motor system, and the conditions in general must be those of complete mental and bodily rest. Here is the psychological equivalent of that which spiritual writers call the quiet, the state defined by one of them as a rest most busy. Those who are in this prayer, says Saint Teresa, wish their bodies to remain motionless, for it seems to them that at the least movement they will lose their sweet peace. 103. Others say that in this state we stop the wheel of imagination, leave all that we can think, sink into our nothingness or our ground. In Ruysbroek's phase, we are inwardly abiding in simplicity and stillness and utter peace. 104. And this is man's state of maximum receptivity. The best and noblest way in which thou mayest come into this work and life, says Meister Eckhart, is by keeping silence and letting God work and speak. When we simply keep ourselves receptive, we are more perfect than when at work. 105. But this preparatory state of surrendered quiet must at once be qualified by the second point, attention. It is based upon the right use of the will, and is not a limp yielding to anything or nothing. It has an ordained, deliberate aim, is a behavior cycle directed to an end, and this it is that marks out the real and fruitful quiet of the contemplative from the non-directed surrender of mere quietism. Nothing, says Saint Teresa, is learnt without a little pains. For the love of God, sisters, account that care well employed, that ye shall bestow on this thing. 106. The quieted mind must receive and hold, yet without discursive thought, the idea which it desires to realize, and this idea must interest and be real for it, so that attention is concentrated on it spontaneously. The more completely the idea absorbs us, the greater its transforming power. When interest wavers, the suggestion begins to lose ground. In spite of her subsequent relapse into quietism, Madame Guyon accurately described true quiet when she said, "Our activity should consist in endeavoring to acquire and maintain such a state as may be most susceptible of divine impressions, most flexible to all the operations of the eternal Word." 107. Such concentration can be improved by practice, hence the value of regular meditation and contemplation to those who are in earnest about the spiritual life, the quiet and steady holding in the mind of the thought which it is desired to realize. Psychotherapists tell us that, having achieved quiescence, we should rapidly and rhythmically, but with intention, repeat the suggestion that we wish to realize, and that the shorter, simpler, and more general this verbal formula, the more effective it will be. 108. The spiritual aspect of this law was well understood by the medieval mystics. Thus the author of The Cloud of Unknowing says to his disciple, "Fill thy spirit with ghostly meaning of this word sin, and without any special beholding unto any kind of sin, whether it be venial or deadly, and cry thus ghostly ever upon one, Sin, 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 out, out, out." This ghostly cry is better learned of God by the proof than of any man by word, for it is best when it is in pure spirit, without special thought or any pronouncing of word. On the same manner shalt thou do with this little word God, and mean God all, and all God, so that naught work in thy wit and in thy will, but only God. 109. Here the directions are exact, and such as any psychologist of the present day might give. So too, religious teachers informed by experience have always ascribed a special efficacy to short acts of prayer and aspiration, phrases repeated or held in the mind, which sum up and express the self's penitence, love, faith, or adoration, and are really brief, articulate suggestions parallel in type to those which Baudouin recommends to us as conducive to bodily well-being. 110. The repeated affirmation of Julian of Norwich, "All shall be well, all shall be well, all shall be well," 111, fills all her revelations with its suggestion of joyous faith, and countless generations of Christians have thus applied to their soul's health those very methods by which we are now enthusiastically curing indigestion and cold in the head. The articulate repetition of such phrases increases their suggestive power, for the unconscious is most easily reached by way of the ear. This fact throws light on the immemorial insistence of all great religions on the peculiar value of vocal prayer, whether this be the mantra of the Hindu or the dhikr of the Moslem, and explains the instinct which causes the Catholic Church to require from her priests the verbal repetition, not merely the silent reading, of their daily office. Hence, too, there is real educative value in such devotions as the Rosary, and the Protestant churches showed little psychological insight when they abandoned it. Such vain repetitions, however much the rational mind may dislike, discredit, or denounce them, have power to penetrate and modify the deeper psychic levels, always provided that they conflict with no accepted belief, are weighted with meaning and desire, with the intent stretched towards God, and are not allowed to become merely mechanical, the standing danger alike of all verbal suggestion and all vocal prayer. Here we touch the third character of effective suggestion, feeling. When the idea is charged with emotion, it is far more likely to be realized. War neuroses have taught us the dreadful potency of the emotional stimulus of fear, but this power of feeling over the unconscious has its good side too. Here we find psychology justifying the often criticized emotional element of religion. Its function is to increase the energy of the idea. The cool, judicious type of belief will never possess the life-changing power of a more fervid, though perhaps less rational faith. Thus, the state of corporate suggestibility generated in a revival, and on which the success of that revival depends, is closely related to the emotional character of the appeal which is made. And on higher levels, we see that the transfigured lives and heroic energies of the great figures of Christian history all represent the realization of an idea of which the heart was an impassioned love of God, subduing to its purposes all the impulses and powers of the inner man. If you would truly know how these things come to pass, said St. Bonaventura, ask it of desire, not of intellect, of the ardors of prayer, not of the teaching of the schools. 112. More and more psychology tends to endorse the truth of these words. Quiescence, attention, and emotional interest are then the conditions of successful suggestion. We have further to notice two characteristics which have been described by the Nancy School of psychologists, and which are of some importance to those who wish to understand the mechanism of religious experience. These have been called the law of unconscious teleology and the law of reversed effort. The law of unconscious teleology means that when an end has been effectively suggested to it, the unconscious mind will always tend to work towards its realization. Thus, in psychotherapeutics, it is found that a general suggestion of good health made to the sick person is often enough. The doctor may not himself know enough about this malady to suggest stage by stage the process of a cure. But he suggests that cure, and the necessary changes and adjustments required for its realization are made unconsciously under the influence of the dynamic idea. Here the direction of the cloud of unknowing. Look that nothing live in thy working mind, but a naked intent directed to God. 113. suggesting as it does to the psyche the ontological object of faith, strikingly anticipates the last conclusions of science. Further, a fervent belief in the end proposed, a conviction of success, is by no means essential. Far more important is a humble willingness to try the method, give it a chance. That which reason may not grasp, the deeper mind may seize upon and realize, always provided that the intellect does not set up resistances. This is found to be true in medical practice, and religious teachers have always declared it to be true in the spiritual sphere, holding obedience, humility, and a measure of resignation, not spiritual vision, to be the true requisites for the reception of grace, the healing and renovation of the soul. Thus acquiescence in belief, and loyal and steady cooperation in the corporate religious life, are often seen to work for good in those who submit to them, though these may lack, as they frequently say, the spiritual sense. And this happens not by magic, but in conformity with psychological law. This tendency of the unconscious self to realize without criticism a suggested end lays on religious teachers the obligation of forming a clear and vital conception of the spiritual ideas which they wish to suggest, whether to themselves in their meditations or to others by their teaching, to be sure that they are wholesome and really tend to the fullness of life. It should also compel each of us to scrutinize those religious thoughts and images which we receive and on which we allow our minds to dwell, excluding those that are merely sentimental, weak, or otherwise unworthy, and holding fast to the noblest and most beautiful that we can find. For these ideas, however generalized, will set up profound changes in the mind that receives them. Thus the wrong conception of self-immolation will be faithfully worked out by the unconscious, and has been too often in the past, in terms of misery, weakness, or disease. We remember how the idea of herself as a victim of love worked physical destruction in Thérèse de l'Enfant Jésus, and we shall never perhaps know all the havoc wrought by the once fashionable doctrines of predestination and the total depravity of human nature. All this shows how necessary it is to put hopeful, manly, constructive conceptions before those whom we try to help or instruct, constantly suggesting to them not the weak and sinful things that they are, but the living and radiant things which they can become. Further, this tendency of the received suggestion to work out its whole content for good or evil within the unconscious mind shows the importance which we ought to attach to the tone of a religious service, and how close too many of our popular hymns are to what one might call psychological sin, stressing as they do a childish weakness, love of shelter and petting, a neurotic shrinking from full human life, a morbid preoccupation with failure and guilt. Such hymns make devitalizing suggestions, adverse to the health and energy of the spiritual life, and are all the more powerful because they are sung collectively and in rhythm, and are cast in an emotional mold. 114. There was some truth in the accusation of the Indian teacher Ramakrishna that the books of the Christians insisted too exclusively on sin. He said, "He who repents again and again, 'I am bound, I am bound,' remains in bondage. He who repeats day and night, 'I am a sinner, I am a sinner,' becomes a sinner indeed." 115. I go on to the law of reversed effort, a psychological discovery which seems to be of extreme importance for the spiritual life. Briefly, this means that when any suggestion has entered the unconscious mind and there become active, all our conscious and anxious resistances to it are not merely useless, but actually tend to intensify it. If it is to be dislodged, this will not be accomplished by mere struggle, but by the persuasive power of another and superior autosuggestion. Further, in respect of any habit that we seek to establish, the more desperate our struggle and sense of effort, the smaller will be our success. In small matters we have all experienced the working of this law. in frustrated struggles to attend to that which does not interest us, to check a tiresome cough, to keep our balance when learning to ride a bicycle. But it has also more important applications. Thus, it indicates that a deliberate struggle to believe, to overcome some moral weakness, to keep attention fixed in prayer, will tend to frustration. For this anxious effort gives body to our imaginative difficulties and sense of helplessness, fixing attention on the conflict, not on the desired end. True, if this end is to be achieved, the will must be directed to it, but only in the sense of giving steadfast direction to the desires and acts of the self, keeping attention oriented towards the goal. The pull of imaginative desire, not the push of desperate effort, serves us best. St. Teresa well appreciated this law and applied it to her doctrine of prayer. If your thought, she says to her daughters, runs after all the fooleries of the world, laugh at it and leave it for a fool, and continue in your quiet. If you seek by force of arms to bring it to you, you lose the strength which you have against it. 116. This same principle is implicitly recognized by those theologians who declare that man can do nothing of himself, that mere voluntary struggle is useless, and regeneration comes by surrender to grace, by yielding, that is, to the inner urge, to those sources of power which flow in, but are not dragged in. Indications of its truth meet us everywhere in spiritual literature. Thus Jakob Boehme says, "Because thou strivest against that out of which thou art come, thou breakest thyself off with thy own willing from God's willing." 117. So too the constant invitations to let God work and speak, to surrender, are all invitations to cease anxious strife and effort, and give the divine suggestions their chance. The law of reversed effort, in fact, is valid on every level of life, and warns us against the error of making religion too grim and strenuous an affair. Certainly, in all the life of the spirit the will is active, and must retain its conscious and steadfast orientation to God. Heroic activity and moral effort must form an integral part of the full human experience, yet it is clearly possible to make too much of the process of wrestling evil. An attention chiefly and anxiously concentrated on the struggle with sins and weaknesses, instead of on the eternal sources of happiness and power, will offer the unconscious harmful suggestions of impotence, and hence tend to frustration. The early ascetics, who made elaborate preparations for dealing with temptations, got as an inevitable result plenty of temptations with which to deal. A sounder method is taught by the mystics. "When thoughts of sin press on thee," says the cloud of unknowing, "look over their shoulders, seeking another thing, the which thing is God." 118. These laws of suggestion, taken together, all seem to point one way. They exhibit the human self as living, plastic, changeful, perpetually modified by the suggestions pouring in on it, the experiences and intuitions to which it reacts. Every thought, prayer, enthusiasm, fear, is of importance to it. Nothing leaves it as it was before. The soul, said Boehme, stands both in heaven and in hell. Keep it perpetually busy at the window of the senses, feed it with unlovely and materialistic ideas, and those ideas will realize themselves. Give the contemplative faculty its chance. Let it breathe at least for a few moments of each day the spiritual atmosphere of faith, hope, and love, and the spiritual life will, at least in some measure, be realized by it. Footnotes. 99. Julian of Norwich, Revelations of Divine Love. 100. Sœur Thérèse de l'Enfant Jésus. 101. William Penn, No Cross, No Crown. 102. De Emet Christi, Book 3. 103. Way of Perfection. 104. The Book of the 12 Beguines. 105. Meister Eckhart. 106. The Way of Perfection. 107. A Short and Easy Method of Prayer. 108. Baudouin, Suggestion and Autosuggestion, Part 2. 109. Opsit. 110. Baudouin, Suggestion and Autosuggestion, Loxit. 111. Revelations of Divine Love. 112. De Itinerario Mentis in Deo. 113. Opsit. 114. Hymns of the Weary Willie type, e.g., O Paradise, who does not sigh for rest, should never be sung in congregations where the average age is less than 60. Equally unsuited to general use are those expressing disillusionment, anxiety, or impotence. Any popular hymnal will provide an abundance of examples. 115. Quoted by Pratt, Religious Consciousness. 116. The Way of Perfection. 117. The Way to Christ, Part 4. 118. Opsit. End of Chapter 4.